Hey everyone, and welcome to another story of Cheating Tales Lab. We're honored to have you here today. Thank you for being part of our community, and we hope this story captivates you. Now, let's dive into this story. The metallic whir of helicopter blades sliced through Seattle's rain-heavy clouds as Antonio Sheridan steadied his patient's foreline. At 45, he'd spent exactly half his life as Seattle's premier trauma flight nurse, and every one of those years showed in the precise economy of his movements. Rain pattered against the helicopter's windows as Jake Morrison, his pilot and friend of 20 years, guided them towards Seattle Grace Hospital. Stats dropping, Antonio called through the headset, his experienced hands already moving to adjust the flow rate. "Jake, we need to pick up the pace." "Already on it," Jake responded, the helicopter banking smoothly as he adjusted their trajectory. 3 minutes out. Antonio nodded, his focus absolute as he monitored the patient's vitals. This was where he belonged, 3,000 feet above Seattle, making split-second decisions that kept people alive. The familiar pressure in his chest tightened slightly, but he ignored it. There would be time for personal concerns later. The landing pad emerged from the mist, its lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Antonio had already radioed ahead. The trauma team would be waiting. As they touched down, he caught sight of his daughter Emma's white coat among the waiting staff. She'd followed him into medicine, though she'd chosen to keep her feet firmly on the ground. "Another miracle in the making," she called out as they rushed the patient inside. "No miracles," Antonio replied, his voice steady as he reported the vital signs. "Just good medicine." It was their usual exchange, comfortable and familiar. But lately, Emma's smile seemed strained, her eyes carrying a weight he couldn't quite understand. He filed the observation away with all the other small changes he'd noticed recently, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet assembled. The annual Seattle Grace Hospital fundraiser transformed the austere medical center's conference center into what Lori Sheridan, his wife of 23 years and head of donor relations, called an appropriate setting for seven-figure donations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in imported silk, while Seattle's medical elite mingled with the city's wealthiest potential donors. Antonio adjusted his bow tie, a concession to the formal dress code he endured once a year. From his position near the bar, he had a clear view of Lori working the room. She moved with practiced grace in her silver Versace dress, a recent purchase she'd claimed was necessary for the position. Dr. Kent Pratt stood too close to her as they spoke with the elderly couple Antonio recognized as major donors. The new cardiothoracic surgeon had arrived 6 months ago with impressive credentials and an ego to match. Now, watching Kent's hands settle on Lori's lower back with casual familiarity, Antonio felt his investigative instincts spark to life. "Your wife certainly knows how to command a room." Sarah Chen's voice carried a note of careful observation as she joined him. Seattle Grace's administrator had been his friend for 15 years, long enough to know when she was probing for information. "She's good at her job," Antonio replied neutrally, noting how Lori and Kent moved between groups in perfect synchronization, their professional smiles never wavering. "Speaking of jobs," Sarah kept her voice low, "have you reviewed the proposal for the new cardiac wing? The one Kent's pushing for?" Numbers seemed rushed. Very rushed. Sarah sipped her champagne. "Interesting choice of contractors, too. Same company that built his wing in Portland. Facility had issues from day one, but the paperwork was impeccable." Before Antonio could respond, Emma appeared at his elbow. His daughter's emerald cocktail dress was a stark contrast to her usual resident scrubs, making her look more like her mother than he'd ever noticed before. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson wants to hear about the mountain rescue from last month." Emma's smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. "You know, the one with the stranded hiking group?" Antonio caught the quick glance she shot toward Lori and Kent. "Mrs. Henderson can wait. Sarah and I were discussing." "Please." Emma's grip on his arm tightened fractionally. "She's considering a major donation to the emergency response unit." Sarah touched his sleeve lightly. "We'll continue this later, Antonio. Some things need a closer look." Her meaningful glance toward Kent and Lori made it clear she wasn't talking about hospital finances. As Emma led him away, Antonio watched Kent lean in to whisper something in Lori's ear. His wife's laugh carried across the room. the same practice sound she used when convincing donors to add zeros to their checks. The rest of the evening followed a pattern. Every time Antonio moved toward Lori and Kent, Emma appeared with another donor who urgently needed to hear his stories. By the time the last guest departed, he'd cataloged 27 instances of unnecessary physical contact between his wife and the surgeon, 15 secretive whispers, and 4 moments when they disappeared briefly from the room within minutes of each other. The drive home was silent, Lori claiming a headache and retiring immediately to their bedroom. Antonio stayed in his study, reviewing hospital documents Sarah had quietly passed him earlier. The numbers for the cardiac wing didn't add up, cost projections were inflated, equipment requests excessive, and the timeline suspiciously accelerated. His chest tightened as he worked, the pain sharper than usual. Another item for his growing list of concerns, filed away with his wife's recent changed behaviors and his daughter's strange anxiety. The following weeks brought a parade of closed-door meetings Lori claimed were donor consultations. Antonio used the time to investigate, his years of emergency response work making him methodical in gathering information. The contractor's bid is 40% higher than market rate, Jake confirmed over coffee in the pilot's lounge between flights. Same pattern as Portland, according to my contacts there. Antonio rubbed his chest absently. Sarah mentioned unusual consultation patterns in the cardiac unit. Private meetings not logged in the official schedule. Speaking of unusual, Jake leaned forward, voice low. You seen the maintenance contracts for the new equipment Kent's requesting? Companies I've never heard of. Terms that make no sense for a hospital our size. Their discussion ended with the emergency alert. Minutes later, they were airborne, heading toward a multi-car pileup on Interstate 5. Antonio pushed personal concerns aside, focusing on the information coming through his headset. The chest pain struck during patient assessment. One moment he was checking pupillary response. The next device clamped around his heart. The pen light clattered to the helicopter floor as pain shot down his left arm. Antonio? Jake's voice seemed distant through the roaring in his ears. Left, chest. Antonio managed, training taking over even as his vision grayed. Radiating arm. Jake's response was immediate. Seattle Grace, Life Flight 7 declaring medical emergency. Flight nurse having severe chest pain, possible MI. Diverting for immediate landing. Antonio fumbled with his Garmin medical watch. Standard equipment Jake had insisted on after too many disputed in-flight decisions. Through the growing haze, he activated the recording feature, years of handling complicated cases having taught him to document everything. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Lori's face as they wheeled him into the ER. Her expression wasn't panic or concern. It was calculated satisfaction as she typed rapidly on her phone. Kent will take excellent care of everything, she said, voice carrying a note of anticipation that sent chills through Antonio's fading awareness. He's the best after all. As darkness claimed him, he heard Kent Pratt's authoritative voice. I'm taking this case. Cancel the on-call surgeon. Recovery brought a steady stream of suspicious activities. Insurance agents Antonio had never met appeared within hours, claiming Lori had contacted them months ago to review their policies. They spoke quietly with Kent between rounds. Their discussions focused on policy details, particularly the triple payout clause for in-hospital deaths. Quite forward-thinking of your wife, one agent remarked while checking Antonio's paperwork. Upgrading the policy when she did. These things are always easier to arrange before any incidents. Kent's residents monitored him constantly, except for Emma, who could barely enter the room. When she did, her hands shook as she checked his vitals, her eyes avoiding his face. Sarah visited late one night, after the residents' rounds. She closed the door carefully before approaching his bed. I've been looking into Kent's previous positions, she said quietly, showing him a folder. 5 hospitals in 10 years. Each had a string of deaths, terminal patients, all with massive insurance payouts. And every time, there was a grieving spouse who suddenly acquired beach property within months. Antonio studied the medication charts Sarah provided, his years of medical experience noting the discrepancies. The doses were subtly wrong, not enough to trigger immediate concerns, but sufficient to slowly stress a recovering heart. Your wife's name is on the title search for a beachfront property in Malibu, Sarah added. Dated 3 months ago, held in a blind trust until closing. The same realtor handled 3 similar properties for widows from Kent's previous hospitals. Before Antonio could respond, footsteps approached. Sarah slipped the folder away as Emma entered. Her white coat wrinkled from a long shift. Dad, she started, then stopped at the sight of Sarah. I should come back later. Stay, Antonio said firmly, but she was already backing toward the door, the same haunted look in her eyes he'd seen at the fundraiser. After she left, Sarah squeezed his hand. Rest. I'm having some people look into things. Just be careful what medications you accept. Antonio closed his eyes, appearing to drift off, but his hand moved slightly, ensuring his medical watch was still recording. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he assembled the pieces of the puzzle. His wife's suspicious behavior, Kent's rushed proposals, Emma's strange actions, and the growing evidence of a deadly pattern repeated across multiple hospitals. The pain in his chest was still there, but now it had a different quality. This wasn't just medical, this was betrayal, carefully planned and professionally executed. But Antonio Sheridan hadn't spent 20 years saving lives by giving up when things got difficult. He kept his breathing steady, listening as Kent's resident adjusted his medication drip. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable patient, weakened by surgery and grief. They had no idea they'd given him exactly what he needed. A front-row seat to their operation, with every word and action recorded by the device on his wrist. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The midnight silence in Antonio's hospital room was broken only by the steady beep of monitors. His eyes remained closed, breathing measured, as familiar voices drifted through his partially open door. The Garmin watch on his wrist blinked silently, recording every word. The Cayman account is ready. Kent's voice carried a hint of impatience. Another week of this waiting game, and we risk someone connecting the patterns. Don't lecture me about patterns, Lori snapped. The clicking of her heels against tile indicated her pacing. I've managed 3 hospitals worth of paperwork without leaving traces. The Malibu property is nearly ready. We stick to the timeline. Your daughter's becoming erratic. Did you see how she fumbled the medication orders yesterday? Emma knows what's at stake. One call to the medical board about her little pharmaceutical adventure during residency, and she'll be lucky to work as a veterinary assistant. Their voices faded down the hallway. Antonio waited 5 minutes, then pressed the call button. Emma appeared moments later, her white coat wrinkled from a long shift, dark circles prominent under her eyes. Your stats look stable, she said mechanically, avoiding his gaze as she checked the monitors. Sit down. Antonio's voice was quiet, but carried the same authority he used during critical rescues. When she hesitated, he added, Remember that hiker we airlifted when you were 10? You held his hand the whole flight, promised him he'd be okay. That's who you are, Emma. Not this. The words hit their mark. Emma collapsed into the chair, tears breaking through her professional facade. I never wanted. During intern year, the hours were endless. Someone offered me Adderall to stay awake, then benzos to sleep. It spiraled so fast. Kent and your mother found out. She nodded miserably. They said they'd help keep it quiet, protect my career. But it was just leverage. First they wanted information about your schedule, access to your records, then medication adjustments, signing off on altered charts. Details. Antonio's voice hardened. Everything they've made you do. Start from the beginning. Emma's confession poured out. How Kent had backdated consultation notes, creating false histories of cardiac symptoms. How Lori used her donor relations position to identify wealthy patients with large insurance policies. The systematic way they stressed recovering hearts with subtle medication changes until natural cardiac events occurred. There are others, Emma whispered. Other residents they control. The private facility they're trying to transfer you to, it's owned by Kent's medical school friend. Patients who go there don't come back. Antonio's expression remained neutral, but his mind cataloged every detail. The medication changes. Show me. Emma pulled out his chart with trembling hands. They're subtle. Microdoses of medications that stress the heart. Nothing obvious enough to trigger pharmacy alerts, but compounding effects over time. She pointed to specific orders. These are all falsified. I signed some of them. You'll sign no more. His tone allowed no argument. Now listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, you'll do your rounds as usual. Act normal. When Kent or your mother give orders, agree, but do nothing. Understood? She nodded, wiping her eyes. Dad, I'm so... Save it. He cut her off. Redemption comes through actions, not words. Go. After she left, Antonio activated his phone. The call was answered on the first ring. Jake. Time to call in that favor from Reuben Benton. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Jake arrived early, carrying coffee and a thick folder of flight logs. Reuben's on board, he reported quietly. Been wanting to nail Kent since his Portland days. I've got documentation of every suspicious patient transfer over the last 6 months. All terminal patients, all wealthy, all dead within days of reaching his friend's private facility. Good. Antonio reviewed the logs. Sarah's blocking their attempt to transfer me there. They'll try something else. As if on cue, Lori swept in, designer heels clicking against tile. Her smile was practiced, predatory. Darling, we've been discussing your care options. Kent knows an excellent private facility. Request denied. Sarachin entered behind her, hospital administrator's badge prominent. Hospital policy requires peer review for high-risk transfers. Dr. Peterson will be taking over Antonio's care. Kent appeared in the doorway, his usual smooth confidence cracking slightly. As department head, Sarah's voice could have cut steel. You're needed in the board meeting. Now. After they left, Sarah turned to Antonio. Reuben's people are in place. We've got FBI agents posing as orderlies on every shift. Security cameras have been adjusted to cover medication storage areas. They'll retaliate, Jake warned. Antonio's smile was cold. I'm counting on it. The counterattack came within hours. Anonymous complaints about Antonio's flight record appeared on Sarah's desk, alleging missed protocols and questionable decisions during critical transports. Amateur work, Jake scoffed, reviewing them. I've got witness statements and documentation for every flight, every decision, every outcome. More concerning was the leak about Emma's drug history to the medical board. But Sarah Chun was prepared. Complete rehabilitation records, she informed the hastily convened review committee, laying out documented evidence. Regular drug tests, counseling sessions, performance reviews. All clean. I can also provide documentation showing who accessed these confidential records without authorization. The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone was facing serious HIPAA violations. Meanwhile, Antonio's watch kept recording. Late-night conversations between Kent and Lori grew increasingly desperate. The insurance companies auditing previous cases, Kent hissed during one midnight visit. We need to finish this now. Then stop talking and do it. Lori's voice was ice. The transfer failed, but we still have medication access. Make it look natural, like the others. The final night arrived exactly as Antonio had predicted. His room was dark when Lori and Kent entered, carrying a new medication bag. Such a shame about these cardiac complications, Lori sighed, her voice dripping false concern. At least the triple payout will secure Emma's future. Speaking of payouts, Antonio's voice caused them both to freeze as he sat up, removing his oxygen mask. You should have checked my watch more carefully, honey. It records everything within 20 feet, including your murder plot. The lights flashed on. FBI agents emerged from the bathroom and supply closet, weapons drawn. Reuben Benton stepped forward, badge gleaming. Dr. Kent Pratt, Mrs. Lori Sheridan, he announced with satisfaction, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and a growing list of federal charges. You can't prove anything, Kent snarled, but his face had gone pale. Actually, Sarachin entered, holding up a tablet. We can prove everything. Your previous victims' families have been very cooperative, once shown evidence of insurance fraud and premeditated murder. As they were led away in handcuffs, Lori attempted one final strike. Emma was involved too. She falsified charts, changed medication order. Under documented coercion, Antonio cut her off coldly. Unlike you, she chose to help stop this before more people died. The arrest continued through the night. Insurance agents who had backdated policies, Kent's friend at the private facility who helped cover up suspicious deaths. The real estate agent holding the Malibu property in trust. Offshore accounts located, Ruben reported as the sun rose. Looks like they've been running this scheme longer than we thought. Multiple hospitals, dozens of victims. Good. Antonio's voice was steel. More evidence for prosecution. The morning brought a parade of federal agents collecting evidence and taking statements. Through it all, Antonio's watch kept recording, not because it was needed anymore, but because thorough documentation had become habit. Sarah Chin surveyed the activity with grim satisfaction. The board will be meeting to discuss emergency replacements in cardiology and donor relations. Check their references thoroughly this time, Antonio suggested, his voice carrying no trace of humor. Emma appeared in the doorway, looking lost. Dad, your statement to the FBI. Everything they made you do, everything you saw. Leave nothing out. His tone was professional, detached. The evidence you've provided helps ensure they can't hurt anyone else. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. There would be time for personal reconciliation later. For now, there was work to be done. Through the window, dawn painted Seattle's skyline in shades of possibility. The conspirators who had thought Antonio vulnerable had learned too late what his patients had always known. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who waits, watches, and strikes with calculated precision when the moment is right. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Antonio Sheridan took the witness stand. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and the trial had exposed a web of corruption deeper than anyone imagined. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Hayes, approached with purpose. Mr. Sheridan, please tell the court about the evidence you gathered. Antonio's voice carried the same steady authority he used in medical emergencies. The watch recordings documented multiple conversations between Dr. Pratt and Lori Sheridan planning my murder. They discussed offshore accounts, property purchases, and how to make my death appear natural. From the defense table, Kent's expensive suit couldn't hide his seething anger. Lori sat beside him, her designer prison jumpsuit a far cry from her usual attire, her face a mask of cold disdain. In the previous cases? Hayes prompted. Investigation revealed similar patterns at 3 other hospitals. Kent would identify wealthy patients through Lori's donor relations network. They'd falsify symptoms, manipulate medications, then profit from insurance payouts when patients died in their private facility. The evidence mounted through the day. Financial records showed millions flowing through shell companies. Former hospital staff testified about suspicious transfers and sudden deaths. Family members of previous victims described identical patterns, loved ones with manageable conditions suddenly deteriorating after meeting Kent and being transferred to his friend's facility. They used their positions to identify targets. Jake Morrison testified, his pilot's precision evident in his detailed documentation. Every wealthy patient with good insurance became a potential victim. The flight records showed a clear pattern of emergency transfers to their private facility, always followed by death certificates citing natural causes. Sarah Chin's testimony proved devastating. Dr. Pratt used his department authority to override normal protocols. Mrs. Sheridan's donor relations position gave them access to patients' financial information. Together, they created a perfect killing system for profit. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Michael Warren, a resident who had worked with Kent at his previous hospital. He blackmailed me too, just like Emma Sheridan. When I threatened to expose him, another resident who knew about the scheme committed suicide. They used that death to control the rest of us, claiming we'd be implicated if we spoke up. Through it all, Antonio sat ramrod straight in the gallery, watching his former wife's facade crack as each new piece of evidence emerged. When she finally took the stand in her own defense, her attempt at playing the victim fell apart under cross-examination. You expect us to believe you were unaware of these deaths? Hayes demanded. I was just doing my job. Lori's voice dripped contempt. Finding donors, building relationships. If some of them happened to die under Kent's care, that's hardly my. Yet you purchased property in Malibu 3 months before attempting to murder your husband, Hayes cut in. Property paid for with money traced directly to previous victims' insurance payouts. Antonio was a fool, Lori snapped, her mask finally slipping. So concerned with saving lives, he never saw the opportunity. Do you know what it's like being married to someone so blindly righteous? Kent understood ambition. He knew how to turn all those dying patients into something useful. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Kent stood arrogantly as the forewoman read the charges, his confidence crumbling with each guilty. 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder. 30 more for the deaths at previous hospitals. Additional decades for fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. Lori's sentencing came next. She remained coldly composed until the judge spoke. Your actions betray not just your marriage vows, but the fundamental trust between medical institutions and the public, he declared. You used your position to identify victims, exploited families at their most vulnerable, and attempted to murder your own husband for profit. 30 years seems insufficient, but it's the maximum I can impose. As they were led away, Lori turned to Antonio. I hope you're satisfied with your moral victory. Was it worth destroying everything we built? Antonio's response was calm, measured, and final. We built nothing. I saved lives while you plotted deaths. The only difference is now everyone knows exactly what you are. The aftermath brought changes. Emma testified about her coerced involvement in exchange for immunity. Her voice shook as she detailed how they'd exploited her addiction and threatened her career. I started using Adderall during intern year, she admitted to the court. Kent found out, offered to help keep it quiet. Then they started small, asking me to adjust medication orders, sign off on chart changes. When I realized what was happening to the patients, they threatened to expose my drug history, said I was already implicated, would lose my medical license. The judge recommended minimum immunity requirements in exchange for her cooperation. Within a week, Emma transferred to Chicago's trauma unit. Her goodbye with Antonio was brief, professional. She left a letter he filed away unopened in his desk, marked simply past complications. Later, cameras caught Kent's private facility being raided, his medical school friend led away in handcuffs. The forensic audit revealed dozens of suspicious deaths, each following the same pattern. Wealthy patients transferred in, massive insurance payouts transferred out. They found offshore accounts totaling millions, Sarah Chin reported, reviewing the final case files in Antonio's office. Every victim's insurance payout, every property deal, all perfectly documented by their own greed. And the Malibu property? Antonio asked, though he already knew. Seized along with everything else. The federal prosecutor is arranging for proceeds to go to the victims' families. Antonio nodded, satisfied. Justice had its own kind of precision, not unlike the medical calculations he made every day in the air. The correct diagnosis, the proper treatment, the right outcome. It all came down to paying attention to details. Weeks passed. The media circus faded. Antonio returned to his trauma flights, the familiar thrum of helicopter blades drowning out courtroom echoes. Each mission reminded him why he'd chosen this path. Not for profit or power, but for the fundamental duty to preserve life. The letters from Emma arrived monthly, postmarked from Chicago. Each one went unopened into the desk box labeled past complications. Some wounds needed time before examination, and Antonio had learned that timing was everything, in medicine, in justice, and in healing. Sarah Chin transitioned out of hospital administration but continued working with oversight committees, using lessons from the case to protect other institutions. Together, they turned their experience into reform, establishing protocols to catch similar schemes before they claimed more victims. Jake remained his steady partner in the air, their wordless understanding strengthened by shared battle scars. They never discussed the trial, but their flight logs became even more detailed, every decision documented with meticulous care. Antonio's legitimate insurance payout could have bought beachfront property in any exclusive neighborhood. Instead, he chose a modest house on Oregon's quiet coast, far from Malibu's pretension. The view wasn't as spectacular, but it was honest, like the work that paid for it. In the end, the biggest change wasn't in policies or procedures. It was in perspective. Every Thursday evening, after his last flight shift, Antonio would take a moment to watch the sunset from 2,000 feet. From that height, the line between light and shadow was crystal clear. He'd learned that some people chose the shadows, turning medicine's healing purpose into a weapon for profit. His job wasn't to understand them or to regret their choices. His job was to recognize the darkness when it appeared, stand against it without flinching, and always fly toward the light of dawn. The helicopter's radio crackled. Another emergency, another life hanging in balance. Antonio pushed memories aside, focusing on the coordinates with professional precision. The past had its place, filed away in courthouse records and desk drawers. The future waited in the next rescue, the next flight, the next chance to prove that even in medicine's darkest corners, there were still those who remembered their fundamental oath. First, do no harm. And for Antonio Sheridan, that was enough. Epilogue. 5 years later. The federal maximum security prison's visitor room remained as austere as the day Lori Sheridan first entered it. 5 years into her 30-year sentence, the former donor relations director's designer confidence had eroded into institutional monotony. Her orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, expensive highlights grown out to reveal steel gray roots. The guard's voice echoed. Visitor for Sheridan. Sarah Chun sat across the table, official paperwork in hand. Your appeal was denied. Again. Get out. Lori's voice had lost its smooth, manipulative edge, replaced by bitter harshness. You'll want to hear this, Sarah continued, unmoved. The feds found another offshore account. The victims' families are getting those funds too. That beach house you dreamed of? They're turning it into a recovery center for medical professionals dealing with ethical pressures. Lori's hands clenched. Still playing the righteous administrator? How's my ex-husband's little reform crusade going? Antonio's foundation has exposed 4 more schemes like yours. Interesting pattern, doctors and administrators working together, targeting wealthy patients. Sound familiar? Sarah's smile was professional, pointed. Your case study is now required reading in medical ethics courses. 3 cells down, Kent Pratt's fall from grace had been even more dramatic. The former surgeon spent 23 hours a day in isolation. Other inmates had their own code about doctors who killed for profit. His medical license was permanently revoked, his academic papers retracted, his name becoming synonymous with healthcare fraud. His latest appeal had included a rambling manifesto claiming conspiracy. The judge's response was brief. Petition denied. Kent's former medical school friend, serving 20 years for his role in the private facility deaths, had turned state's evidence, providing details of even more victims. Meanwhile, Seattle Grace Hospital had transformed. Antonio's trauma flight program now included intensive ethics training. Every new flight nurse learned not just medical procedures, but warning signs of institutional corruption. Your primary duty is to your patients, he told each class, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Politics, profit, pressure. None of that matters at 2,000 feet with a life in your hands. Jake Morrison, still his pilot after 25 years, would add his own lessons. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, it probably is. Their partnership had become legendary in emergency response circles. Each flight logged with military precision, every decision documented, creating an unbreakable chain of accountability. Sarah Chin's retirement from hospital administration hadn't slowed her down. The foundation she and Antonio started had grown into a national watchdog organization. They provided anonymous reporting systems, legal support, and protection for medical professionals facing ethical dilemmas. We lost 2 residents to suicide because they felt trapped, she reminded oversight committees. That never happens again. Emma found her own path to redemption in Chicago. Rising to chief resident, she channeled her experience into protecting new doctors from similar exploitation. Her trauma unit became known for both medical excellence and ethical integrity. Her monthly letters to Antonio continued, still filed unopened in his desk, but recently, he'd moved them to a new box labeled Future Considerations. Some wounds healed enough to examine, given time. The Oregon Coast House proved perfect for Antonio's needs. Close enough to his flight duties, far enough from painful memories. On clear evenings, he'd watch the sunset from his deck, the same time he used to view it from the helicopter. The final ironies proved fitting. Lori's carefully hidden funds now supported whistleblower programs. Kent's private facility became a treatment center for impaired medical professionals. Their elaborate scheme to profit from death instead strengthened protections for life. Prison reports showed their true characters. Lori attempted to manipulate other inmates, only to find her tactics useless in a world where designer smiles meant nothing. Kent's arrogance crumbled into paranoid isolation, his surgeon's hands now used only to write failed appeals. They aged separately, similarly. Each court rejection, each seized asset, each new revelation of their crimes stripped away more of their carefully constructed facades. The beautiful socialite and ambitious surgeon reduced to cautionary tales and medical ethics lectures. Their victims' families found different forms of closure. Some used the recovered funds for medical scholarships. Others established patient advocacy programs. All ensured their loved ones' deaths served to protect future patients. Antonio's foundation grew beyond its origins. They trained hospital staff to recognize warning signs, provided legal resources for ethical challenges, and maintained a database of suspicious patterns in patient care. The system only works if we protect those who protect patients, he would tell medical boards. His testimony helped pass legislation strengthening whistleblower protections in healthcare. Jake still flew their regular routes, their weekly sunset flights now a tradition. They'd added a third seat for training new flight nurses, passing on lessons learned at terrible cost. Sarah Chin's oversight committees expanded nationally. Corruption thrives in shadows, she testified before medical boards. Our job is to keep the lights on. Emma's trauma unit in Chicago became a model program, combining intensive medical training with ethical leadership. Her residents learned early that moral courage was as vital as medical skill. The desk box of her letters remained ready. When the time came to open them, Antonio knew the conversations would be about future healing, not past wounds. The final word came through official channels. Lori and Kent's last appeal had been rejected. The court's language was unmistakable. They would serve every day of their 30 years. In his Oregon home, Antonio filed the notice without comment. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new patients, new chances to prove that medicine's highest purpose remained unchanged. To heal, to protect, to serve life rather than profit from death. The helicopter waited on its pad, blades ready to turn, Jake checking the pre-flight list with characteristic precision. Another trauma call, another life hanging in balance. Some chose darkness, others chose light. Antonio Sheridan had always known which way to fly.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.